Chapter 14. Passage. Jenny let out an anguished scream as a beam of sparkling yellow light struck her from the tip of Klemper's staff. The light spread itself slowly over Jenny's body, steadily wrapping her in a kind of magical cocoon. "Jenny!" Prince Goatee called, his voice dripping with concern. Jenny could hear the prince as he tried to free himself from the chair again, but it was to no avail. Klemper glanced towards the prince for a second, then returned his attention to Jenny, concentrating on the spell he had cast on her. "That pain you feel, my dear, is because every particle of your body is slowly being torn away from your body and eradicated. Don't worry, the pain won't last forever. In about 5 minutes' time you'll be dead." "Please," the prince begged. "Why do it that way? Please, just give her a quick and painless death." Klemper turned his attention to the prince just long enough to say, "Are you not having fun, my dear prince? Why, I'm only doing this for your viewing pleasure. In time I shall also take great delight in bringing slow and excruciating pain to both your mother and your sister, all so that you and your father can watch and have something to remember them by for the last few days of your lives. I love you, Daffodil." Jenny could barely hear the prince calling to her. She was in agony. She felt as if she was slowly being torn apart. She could hardly move without causing more pain. She began to wish her ordeal was over, so she could just die. Klemper claimed that this would last for about 5 minutes. Her torture had only just begun. The intensity of the yellow light suddenly increased. The sparkles seemed to move at about 3 times the speed they had before, and the light itself seemed to turn a slight shade of orange. Jenny screamed. Then Jenny's ordeal was over, and Klemper was the one screaming. Klemper had fallen to his knees, his hands on either side of his head. "I'm sorry, master," he yelled. "I forgot you wanted her alive." Unable to concentrate on keeping his prisoners in their chairs, Klemper's pain had another consequence. "We're free," Prince Goatee yelled. "Let's get out of here." Jenny hesitated. The pain fading into memory, she looked about the floor and nearby tables, wondering what Klemper had done with the dagger. "Jenny," the prince yelled, "let's go. There are too many." Suddenly Jenny became aware that the other harpy servants were gathering, and although they seemed uncertain what to do as Klemper had collapsed in a screaming heap, some of them were beginning to get dangerously close. Jenny began to run. She leapt onto the head table and jumped over the suckling pig, pursuing the other 4 royals who had already made it to the door that led into the royal quarters. There was a single soldier on duty just the other side of the door, one of the king's own palace guards. Prince Goatee wasted no time. He ran into the guard, pushing him against the wall while relieving him of the small dagger that he carried about his waist. Then, without waiting to see if he was truly in the pay of the elves, he thrust the dagger deep into the gaps between the plates of the soldier's armour. Jenny caught up just as the soldier fell dead to the floor. "Hope he was an enemy," the queen commented. "Me too," the prince replied. He didn't hang about. He relieved the corpse of its sword and then began to run again. "Wait!" the king shouted as he followed close behind. "I know a way. Follow me." The king took the lead. They ran along well-carpeted hallways and corridors and past several rooms, most of which Jenny couldn't help noticing had windows to the outside, windows through which they might have been able to climb and escape the palace. The harpy servants were hot on their trail, but harpy legs tire quickly, and the 5 royals were easily able to outpace them, and there was no one in the corridors. On most days there would be a palace guard on duty at every intersection and nearly every doorway. Now all these places were vacant. Klemper obviously had a need for posting these guards elsewhere in the palace. Once the royals had passed them on their way to the feast, the guards must have left their posts in order to attend to these new duties. "Are you all right?" Prince Goatee asked Jenny as they ran. "That was quite a vicious spell Klemper was using on you." Jenny offered her husband a reassuring smile. She wished she felt as if she meant it. The memory of all that pain was still fresh. As they ran, she began to take off the white servant's gloves, leaving them on the floor behind her. Now, with her hands free, she could cast properly should the need arise. Jenny also removed Sue's enchanted ring from her finger. Her body reverted to its normal appearance. She was back in the clothing she had gotten married in. "Oh, your lovely dress!" The queen, running just behind Jenny, cried. "It's ruined!" Jenny didn't respond. Instead she tucked the ring into one of the flimsy pockets of her top, along with her wedding ring. It was always possible that such a trinket might come in useful later. The king led the way, with the prince and Jenny close behind, while the queen and Princess Arliss brought up the rear. Tears were streaming down Alice's cheeks. The palace library wasn't really all that far from the great hall, but with harpies chasing them, it felt like a miniature marathon. The main door to the library was large and thick, made of solid oak. What was more, the door had a keyhole. Once everyone had entered and the door was closed, the king pulled a key out of his pocket and locked it. "That won't hold a harpy for long," Prince Goatee commented. "I hope there's another part to this escape plan." "There is," the king said. The library was large, very large. It put Jenny's father's tiny collection of reading materials to shame. There were shelves on nearly every wall, from the floor to a ceiling that stood at least 10 feet above them. The room was so large that it required 2 long, thin central support walls, and each of these support walls also had shelves resting on either side. There were just a few gaps between the shelves where lanterns were hanging unlit. At this time of day, the main source of light was that which flooded in through the 2 large windows placed high on one of the only 2 walls in the library that didn't have shelves covering it. There was also a scattering of comfortable-looking chairs and a few tables, so that the books could be read in the library. The 2 walls that were bare of shelving stood opposite each other, balancing the look of the room. The wall with the 2 large windows also had a large landscape painting adorning its brickwork. It was a beautiful scene, a field of growing corn with an idyllic red brick farmhouse in the background. The other wall contained only a fireplace. It had obviously been built to keep those using the library warm during the winter months. The mantelpiece above the fireplace was very high. It would be easy for nearly anyone to just walk into the fire. It was a sort of place that cried out, "Secret passage." Jenny couldn't help worrying that if it was so obvious to her, it would be obvious to those following. The prince grabbed one of the more comfortable-looking chairs and began to head back to the door with it, no doubt to try and wedge the handle. "Leave that," the king told him. "It won't hold them. Follow me." He began to lead the way over to the huge painting of the farmland scene. "I had intended to show you this soon anyway. Now then, everyone link hands." Jenny dutifully took hold of one of the prince's hands and one of Princess Alice's. This couldn't be an escape route, though. She had seen this with Mangloss. This could only trap them, in the painting. "Now, son," the king said, "listen and watch carefully. If we ever win back the palace, you may have to pass this knowledge on to your own son one day." The king placed the palm of his hand against the painting and began to mutter a short incantation. A moment later, the 5 of them were standing in a beautiful cornfield. There was corn to be seen in all directions for miles around, and only the red brick farmhouse did anything to break the view. There was a gentle breeze that caused the corn to sway just slightly. There was no sign of animal life, other than the 5 of them. "Come on," the king said. He let go of his wife's hand and began to walk briskly towards the farmhouse. "We don't have long before they find us." Much like Mangloss's cottage, this must have once been a real location. However, while the cornfields outside the farmhouse made for an idyllic picture, the inside of the farmhouse did not. There were 2 rooms on the lower floor with little more than a couple of planks of wood nailed up to separate the 2. One had no doubt been intended as the kitchen and the other as a kind of living space, but it was impossible to tell which was which. The only real clue was that a door led out of the room on the right to a short hallway and some stairs leading up to the next level. The room had been emptied. There was no furniture, no trinkets or knickknacks lying around, nothing, except that was for the large lever sticking up from the middle of the left side of the room into which the 5 royals had entered the house. It was a long lever, at least waist high. What was more, Jenny could clearly see the thing glowing with a gentle blue light. The king wasted no time. He walked over to the lever and grasped it in both hands. He pulled the thing, trying first one direction and then the other until it began to move. The king kept pulling until the lever resolutely refused to budge any further. By then it was sticking out of the ground at an angle of roughly 45 degrees. "It's been so long since this was actually used," the king said. "I hope it still works." "Now what?" the queen asked. "Now we join hands again," the king replied. "Come on, quickly, the harpies might already be knocking down the library door." Jenny quickly took hold of her husband's and Princess Alice's hands again and waited while the king reversed the chant that he had used to get them into the painting. They re-emerged in the library, and in much the same way as Mangloss's painting of a cottage worked, they were standing in almost exactly the same places as they had before they had entered it. "We're back in the library," Princess Alice commented, sniffing sadly. Yes, dear, Queen Delina replied. Just follow your father, dear. Come on, the king ordered. He began to run across the library towards the wall with the fireplace and the all too obvious secret passage. Even from across the library it was clear that the wall which had been behind the fireplace was gone now, leaving a gaping hole into a dark tunnel beyond. Jenny would have to admit, though, that if the only way to open the passage was by entering the painting first, then they should be fairly safe. An archmage like Klemper would almost definitely be able to work out the correct chant to enter the painting given time, but they would be long gone by then. As the king reached the fireplace, there came a loud thump at the library door. "The harpies have found us," the prince declared. There was another hefty knock on the heavy oak door, and the sound of wood splintering. It wasn't going to take them long to get through. "Come on," the king ordered. "That door isn't going to stand forever." The king ducked inside the opening of the tunnel. The other four followed him in quick succession, and as the last of them crossed the threshold of the fireplace, the king pressed a blue glowing button on the side wall of the tunnel, and the wall behind the fireplace slowly coalesced back into existence. With the wall back in place, the five royals were cast into thick black darkness. In the library, they could hear the huge oak door finally breaking under the strain. Harpies were pouring into the library after them. "We're safe now," the king assured the others. "I don't care how strong they are, they won't be getting in here any time soon." Then, almost as an added thought, he said, "Every palace should have an escape tunnel." Princess Alice began to cry again. She wasn't the only one. Jenny was certain she could hear the queen sniffling somewhere nearby. She wanted to cry herself, but after the events of fighting Su, then Klemper, and then running for her life, she had so much adrenaline running through her body that all she could do was shiver, as if with delayed fear. Had she been able to see Prince Goatee in that darkness, she would have seen that he too had tears running down his face. The king let out a loud sigh. "Now you see why I didn't want your harpy back in the kingdom." Jenny could only guess he was talking to her. "Race isn't like that." Then she remembered she had seen him with a flight of other harpies. They had been hunting, and he had looked every bit one of them. He wasn't like that. "This is hardly the time, dear," Queen Delina insisted. "Perhaps we should move on, just in case they do find a way through." "You're right, my love," the king replied. "This way, I think. I wish I could see where I was going." I think I can fix that," Jenny replied. "Ouch!" the king muttered, cursing under his breath. "Not that way." "Goatee, where are you? I need to borrow your body," Jenny commented. "I'd love to, Daffodil," the prince replied in all seriousness, "but I'm not sure this is the right time." "Not that," Jenny scolded. She sighed. "I can't cast this spell on myself." "You can cast magic," the queen said indignantly. "This isn't the time," the king defended. "Got you," the prince replied. "Where are you?" "Follow my voice." She reached out with her hand and searched with it until it hit something that felt like an arm, and then she sought the end of that something and found a hand. "Is this you?" "If that's you," the prince replied. "Right, stay there," Jenny instructed him. It wasn't a difficult spell, a few quick words, and then she stroked his hand. The spell worked. Finally, a spell had worked. Prince Goatee was standing before them, illuminating their immediate surroundings as if he was a human lantern. The light wasn't that great. They could see maybe 10 feet ahead and behind, but it was better than trying to navigate the way in pitch darkness. "Thank you, Jenny," the king said. "This way, follow me." The tunnel was quite dull. Nothing but an arched brick roof and a rough concrete floor. It was an old tunnel. There were cobwebs everywhere, and one spider had built a web right across the tunnel passage. The tunnel itself seemed to be in fairly good condition, though. There was a little bit of brick dust and old mortar on the concrete floor where time had eroded the roof, but there were no gaps for missing bricks, and no large piles of brick dust where an entire brick had crumbled away. The king and the prince led the way along the tunnel together, the king obviously using the light emanating from his sun to see where he was going. Just a short distance from the fireplace was a spiral staircase leading down. There was only enough room for them to descend in single file, so the king led the way. Prince Goatee was about to follow his father down the stairs when his mother stopped him. "You go in the middle, dear. That way we'll all be able to see something." Then she began to descend the stairs after her husband. Prince Goatee followed third, with Alice and Jenny bringing up the rear. As they descended, Alice and Jenny held each other's hands for support. It was a long way down. There were times when Jenny began to imagine that they were going to descend all the way down to the centre of the world. She held on to Alice all the way, Jenny could hear the princess sobbing quietly to herself as they descended. Eventually, though, they did reach the bottom. The king waited patiently until everyone had caught up, and then began to lead the way along another long passageway. "This must have been built under the palace dungeons," he commented. "Really? They seemed very deep," Jenny asked. "There are 3 levels of dungeons under the palace," Prince Goatee commented. This passage was of about the same width as the one at the top of the staircase. It had been designed with someone shorter in mind, so the 2 men and Queen Delina had to stoop a little as they walked. Fortunately for both the young princesses, they weren't quite tall enough for that to become an issue. Nevertheless, Jenny began to dread thinking about all the brick dust and the cobwebs, possibly complete with spiders that were going to end up in her hair. As the passage continued, Jenny couldn't be certain, but she began to suspect that it was climbing very slowly. They followed it for a couple of miles until they came to another spiral staircase. Only this one led up. Again, the king led the way, followed by the queen and the prince third, supplying a little bit of light for everyone as before. Jenny and Arliss held hands as they ascended. At the top was a large metal grate similar to a cattle grid, but by the look of what lay beyond, it was indoors. From this vantage point it wasn't that clear where they were, only that whatever it was, it had to be well beyond the walls of the palace. There was a wooden roof and a lot of sawdust covering the floor, and one other thing. "It smells of horse dung," the queen commented. "Yes," the king agreed. He tried to lift the grate, but it wouldn't budge. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I wasn't expecting this. I'm afraid our only way out is locked. If I ever had the key to this thing, I don't know where it is now." "I don't want to go back," Princess Arliss commented. "Let me have a look," Jenny called up. Jenny squeezed her way past her husband, then the queen, until she was standing next to the king. Then she examined the grate. It was very old and rusted on the underside, and from the feel of it, the upper side wasn't faring a lot better. She hoped her spell would work with a lock so heavily rusted. She made a quick gesture with her hand. This was such an easy spell that she no longer even had to speak to cast it. The lock, despite what it must have been centuries of rust, sprung open. "Okay, got it," Jenny commented. She pushed the grate open and led the way up the last few steps of the staircase and into the room.